shepherd. The shepherd had been watching his wife's father's sheep. It tells you a little bit about the shepherd because he'd been doing this for about 40 years and he really didn't have any flocks of his own. Still watching his father-in-law's sheep. His father-in-law had a kind of unusual name. His name was Jethro. You might know him from the Beverly Hillbillies. A little different Jethro than what we're talking about. But no, this man's father-in-law's name was Jethro, and he was just taking care of his sheep. And one day he was taking care of Jethro's sheep and decided to go to a new place that he hadn't really been very much. The area that he was in wasn't really necessarily lush, but there was enough there to find pasture. But you had to go find pasture sometimes, so he went a little bit west on this mountainside, and he came to a new spot. And that's when something caught his eye. Something that he'd never seen before. And we're talking about a shepherd, right, that has been in the wilderness area and the region that he's in, these pastures and places for about 40 years. He sees a lot of things. He's seen this kind of sight before, but there was something different. You see, from time to time there would be a lightning crash, and there would be fires. You would see dry things light up and be on fire. But this particular day, on this particular moment, something happened. The shepherd looked and he saw fire coming from a bush. But the fire that was coming from the bush, it wasn't burning up the bush. And a shepherd who's seen a lot of stuff, who's seen some fires before maybe in his lifetime, would understand something burning and burning up, but he's never seen anything burning but never burned up. This guy's name, the shepherd's name is Moses. You might know him. You might know this story. He sees this bush on fire, and he sees it's not burning up, and so, of course, he's going to go check it out. So he turns from the side from where he's planning to go, and he turns off to go see this shrub, this brush that's on fire but not burning up. And as he gets closer, all of a sudden he hears a voice. And a voice, and it was like an angel of God that talked to him and called out his name and said, "Moses, Moses." Okay, now we've got a whole new day. This is something that's never happened before, let alone a bush on fire that doesn't burn up. But now there's a voice calling my name. And the voice says, "Moses, Moses." And Moses does probably what any of us would do. "Here I am, present." And he gets closer, and the voice says, "Don't come any closer. The place that you're standing is on holy ground. Take off your sandals because you're in a place that nothing before has ever happened like this, and someone is here that you've never encountered before. This is something that you've never witnessed. This is something that you've never seen. This is a moment like you've never had." It's the famous story of the call of Moses. It's Moses in the burning bush. It's Moses hearing this voice and hearing the call, and then covering his face because he was afraid of what he was hearing and who he was seeing. And then this voice called back to Moses and says, "I've got a people, your people, that you left back in Egypt." That's right, back in Egypt, because you see, it wasn't always that Moses was out in the wilderness being a shepherd. There was once upon a time that Moses actually was something. I got to take you a little bit back to Egypt so you can kind of know the story. There was a Pharaoh, a king of Egypt, and Moses' people, the Israelites, had grown up and become really, really strong and really, really great. Because of that, they decided to put them to work as slaves. And they kept just growing and becoming greater and greater. So then he issued this decree that every male child born to these Israelite people would need to be killed. But Moses, when he was born, his mom had a plan. And of course, she made that basket and she put him into the river. And along came Pharaoh's daughter and rescued this little baby because she thought it was so sad. And so Moses grew up actually as a prince of Egypt. That was 40 years ago because something happened. You see, as Moses had gotten old enough, he once saw an Egyptian man mistreating one of his fellow Hebrews, and so he struck him dead. And when it was found out that Moses had committed this crime, Moses fled, and that's why we find now Moses being a shepherd. But God says to him in that bush, "I want you to go back to my people, and I want you to tell them that I will come down and rescue them and take them to a place that I promised them. I want you to know, and I want you to tell them that I've heard them crying out over these years and years of slavery, and I'm going to come to the rescue." And in Exodus chapter 3, we see the story of Moses, and we see this interaction that Moses has as he talks to this voice, as God speaks with him, as he encounters God, something that has never been like anything that's ever happened for him in his life. In Exodus chapter 3, we'll pick up the story and continue to see this walk. And as we do, we see something, we pick up on something as we think about the essence of God that we learn in the story of Moses talking with God in this burning bush. Something about God that not only speaks to Moses, but it speaks to us. Something about Moses and something about God and something about a people in slavery that shows us something about who God really is way back in Exodus chapter 3. In verse 11, Moses says to God this, a great question. He says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" That's a great question, but it's the wrong question. It's a great question. It's probably the question I would ask, like, who am I? I can't do something like this, because here's what Moses is thinking. Let's talk about the greatest nation on planet Earth. And let's talk about the strongest power. And let's talk about how they're so strong that they're enslaving hundreds and thousands of my people. And I'm one man, and I'm going to go do this? So that's probably a great question. At least Moses thinks it is. But it's the wrong question. Because there's something that Moses misses when he asks this question. Here's what God says in verse 12. God says, "I will be with you." God wants to be sure that Moses gets something that we all need to make sure we get to. It's not who I am that's going to do anything. It's that God is going to be with me that's going to accomplish anything in this story and this call of Moses. It's kind of like the story of the Sunday school class that was walking through this very story and reading the text. And then in this adult Sunday school class, this middle-aged couple was asked by the preacher who was teaching the class if they would read the story. And he asked the husband if he would read the parts that God speaks in this text. And he asked if the wife would read the parts of Moses. So they agreed, and they started reading down through the story of the burning bush. When they got to verse 15 was the first time they experienced a hiccup. Whenever she, the wife, accidentally began to read God's line. And so, when she began to read the wrong line and read God's line that her husband was supposed to read, the preacher who was teaching the class said, "Oh, wait a minute, you're not God." And the husband, without missing a beat, deadpanned and said, "I've been trying to tell her that for 18 years. My battery's gone now. I have. I need batteries. Or mine. Should I tell the joke again for bigger laughs? You're not God. And that's the starting point for the story with Moses. That's the starting point when we come to this story as well. See, that's what Moses needed to understand. It's not that he could do it. He couldn't do it. Only God could do it. And that's where we have to really start. You might think of this story, you might think of Moses, and you naturally probably go to Charlton Heston. And you probably think of the Ten Commandments movie. There's a story of a little girl who watched this movie with her family. And she heard this line that comes out in Exodus chapter 3. If you wonder why I wear a headset, you'll figure it out by the time this message is done. In Exodus chapter 3, as the story continues, God says, "I'll be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." So God sets up Moses to know that he's going to be Charlton Heston to go and rescue these people. And he says this, Moses says this in verse 13, "Suppose I do go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What's his name?' Then what shall I say to them?'" And so this answer, which comes out in that movie that Charlton Heston plays, God says to Moses this, "Tell them, I am who I am." So this little girl who's 4 years old hears this in the line in the movie, and for the next few days she just ran around the house saying that line, and she kept saying, I'm not who I'm not. That's what she just kept saying. I'm not who I'm not. Because she thought that was a line from the movie. And that's the whole point. As Moses interacts with God here, that's the foundation of where he has to begin. He has to understand he's not that he's not. God is who he is. And this answer that God gives to Moses here, when Moses has a really great legitimate question like, who should I say is sending me? Tell him I am who I am. When you answer with that kind of question and you get that kind of answer, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, what kind of name is that? What kind of answer is that? I'm supposed to say, I am who I am has sent me? That's so weird. That's not correct grammar. Could you please give me another name to use, like Bob or Steve or Carl or something that would be just so much easier for people to understand, not I am who I am. But God says in verse 14, this is what you're to say, I am has sent me to you. Sounds so confusing. But what you see in this name, I am, the I am who I am, is you see God pointing to something that we learn about the essence of who God is from this story, is that God is self-existent. And I wanted to just put a definition on the screen today so you can kind of just be on the same page as we begin, as we're walking through the series to uncover the character and nature and the attributes of God. You've got to see this, that God is self-existent. When we say God is self-existent, here's what we mean. God is grounded only in himself. And so that means he is not dependent on his creation. And that is totally something utterly different than anything we are. Now, we've already established that we are not like him. We've done that from the get-go. But we see this in his self-existence. We all have an origin story. In fact, our origin story, our beginning, comes from God. And so it is the type of question that we'll ask, a little kid will ask when he starts thinking about God. They'll ask this question, well, who made God? That's what every little kid wants to know. How did it all begin? In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is the text where the whole Bible starts out on this page to tell us, here's where it began. In the beginning was God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. See, the beginning of the Bible is the beginning of our story, but the beginning of God's story, I know it's so hard to comprehend, but there's no beginning. He always is. He's the self-caused cause. There is nothing that caused God to come into being. And as man has tried to describe so many times how did this all begin, we've come up with theories. People will use the Bible to find the true theory, the true truth, not a theory at all. Or they'll try to come up with other theories, and that's why we have Big Bang theories. Because people are trying to figure out how all this got here and how all this happened and where it all began. Because we want to know how it all started. And so you get into this game where you start asking this question. Let's just say that you think the Big Bang Theory is how it went down. Okay, well, how did the gases and the matter and all of that happen that, makes up this Big Bang Theory? Because you got to ask an origin story. Well, how did the matter get here? And how did the gases get here? And where did that come from that made that all go boom? And then you've got to ask another question. So if you're trying to figure out God, you might ask that same question, like, how did God get here? Who made God? And let's just say you came up with some other strange theory. I know who made God. It was some other foreign God. Okay, who made that God? Oh, I know who it was. It was an alien way, way out there. Okay, who made the alien? Do you see the game that you never stop playing if you try to figure out if God has a beginning? This is why we say that God is self-existent. Because God is the self-caused cause. He actually can make something from nothing. And he made the heavens, and he made the earth, and he made us. And when he did make us, in that creation, he made us to be creatures that are made in his image. And when we're made in his image, here's what comes into the story. We have the great I am compared to who we're not. And because God made us, he made us with the ability to exercise moral choice. And so we have the chance to choose holiness. And as Moses approaches the burning bush, God says, don't come any closer. And Moses covers his face. And he takes off his sandals because he realizes there's something utterly different, and he sees something completely in another realm from what he is. And he recognizes the holiness, and he chooses to stop. And we have the choice to see holiness and choose that. And we also have the choice to choose sin. And we know the story from Genesis 1 that moves to Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve were in a perfect paradise, and they decided to choose. And when they chose sin into this picture, it became this drastic difference that we realize that we are not like him. He's self-existent, and we depend totally on him. And our depending on him, it leads us to this place where instead of saying, he is who he is, and I'm not him at all, sin leads us to the spot that we should be these mortal creatures that bow down and worship God, but instead here's what we do. We take God off the throne, and we elevate ourselves up to the throne, and we create the kingdom of I am. And our sin takes us to that place that we think it's all about us. And the first thing that Moses needs to see here, and the first thing that we have to see when we see the attributes of God and talk about his self-existence, is that actually means he is who he is, and I am not. And it's so difficult for us to be able to weed out all of the essence of our sin when we're trying to be the I am. Because we really are not. God is great. He shows Moses who he is. He tells him his name. And then he says in verse 15 to Moses, say to the Israelites this, tell them the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. I'm the same God that you've always known, that your fathers have known. Now, it's been 400 years. And those people in Israel, you got to think that some of them might have kind of forgotten about God, but you definitely might have thought that maybe they believed that God had forgotten about them, because they're in slavery. And by the way, when God does send Moses, it just makes things worse, because the Egyptians make it harder for them to do their work, and their oppression grows, and their voice is crying out for a rescue. And you have to wonder if maybe they're thinking if God actually can even hear them. But this is what God says to Moses. He says, this is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. He says this, verse 16, go assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. Do you ever feel like God's not watching? Do you ever feel like God doesn't care? Do you ever feel like God doesn't see you? If you've ever felt that way, then you know what the Israelites are feeling. You know what they're feeling as they're in their 430 years of slavery before they finally get out. You know the oppression that's there, the cries that are ringing up to God's ears, and they wonder if God hears. When you're going through your slavery, when you're going through your hurts, when you're going through your pains, you probably have stopped and asked this question, does God even see me anymore? I want you to know when God shows up to Moses to tell him that he's going to rescue his people, this is not some sort of new decision. I want you to know that when God shows up to rescue through Moses, he says, I'm going to do something that I already knew I was going to do 430 years ago. I've just chosen to do it now. Here's the thing about our suffering. So many times all we want is relief. And when we want the relief and we don't get the relief, we feel like God doesn't see us. But I want you to see that God has watched and observed. And it seems like it's torment for God to watch and observe what we're going through if we don't see the relief. But I want you to know that even in the pain and even with the answer of relief that comes, that God actually sees you, he doesn't forget you, and he can actually be glorified in both. Romans chapter 8 is a great text. You can just go read the whole chapter, especially if you feel like God's not hearing you. Because the whole chapter talks about the promises that God has, that God promises to us that our momentary troubles are nothing God sees us really can be everything. Deuteronomy chapter 18, if you can turn there in your Bibles. Deuteronomy 18. In Deuteronomy 18, we see that God does not forget. We see that God not only sees, observes, and knows, but we see what God will do next. Deuteronomy chapter 18, if you look at verse 18, here's what God promises. So this is sometime later. This is after Moses has led the people out of Israel. This is after he's rescued the people. God says this: I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that's a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously, so do not be alarmed. In this text, God is saying, I will deliver a promised one, a prophet that will come to you. Thank you. That was driving me crazy. Came to my rescue, Rick. Appreciate it. And in this text, what God is saying is, not only that I've seen you, I've observed you, I've watched you, but I also have a promise for you. That even after Moses is gone, I have another promise. And if you flip back to the Exodus text, that's exactly what the promise is that's going to come through Moses. Exodus chapter 3, again, you pick the story back up, and here's what he says in verse 17. This is what God said to Moses. I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites. Here's what God says to Moses. I have seen you. I observe you. I watch you. And I promise you, not only will I send you Moses to rescue you Israelites, but I'll send you one to come that's going to be like Moses that we read about in Deuteronomy 18. It will be this one named Jesus. And when Jesus comes, it's God's promise that he made so long ago to be there, to come for us, to rescue us, and it makes all the difference. I love the story John Ortberg tells. He talks about living in South Carolina, and he was walking along one time along the streets with a couple of his friends as he was there in Newport Beach. And he said there was this bar that they walked by, and it was just kind of like out of a movie scene. A few men come tumbling out of the bar, fighting a big old fist fight. And he said 2 or 3 of them had kind of ganged up on one of these guys, and his forehead was all bloody. And so him and his friends just kind of witnessed this, just bounce onto the street right in front of them, and they decide, well, we should probably do something. And so they decide to interject, and so they come up and they say, hey, you guys, cut it out, quit fighting and trying to break it up. And the guys just kind of turn at them at first, and they're kind of looking like they're going to come after them, and then all of a sudden their demeanor changes. And these men who've been fighting and kind of ganged up on this one guy, they kind of started to slink back and slink away. And John Ortberg and his friends were like, whoa. When they turned behind them and they looked, and there was this 6'3", 300-pound man who had like 2% body fat standing behind them. All of a sudden, the attitude of these guys had changed because Bubba was there. He said, now we never called Bubba that to his face, but that's what we called him later when we talk about the story. And John Ortberg says it changed everything in that story because of who showed up. And he asks this question, just how big is your God? When God says, I promise, it's saying God is going to show up. Now, some of your texts, when you read that verse 17, it doesn't say, I promise. It will just say, and God said. Because that's as good as his promise. If God says, well, that is his promise. And what the Israelites need is a promise to be rescued from their slavery. And what God sends them is someone to help deliver that promise named Moses. And what we need is someone to deliver us from our slavery to sin, from the life that we find ourselves stuck in. We need a rescuer. And we need someone who's promised, and God sends Jesus to be that prophet that comes and brings us up out of our misery. See, that's the last thing that we see that God wants to do here. God sees them. He is who He is. He's always been. He will deliver on His promise because He will bring them up out. Here's the thing about what God is saying here. I will rescue. I've seen. I've got a promise that I've got something better in store for you. I've got a promised land that I'm going to send you to. And so you see a God who's self-existent, who can do something with nothing. Because it seems impossible for the Israelites to be rescued. 430 years enslaved. But I am. He can do that. And you see a bush that's on fire, and it's not burning up. Now, how does that happen? Well, I am can do that. And you see a prophet that's going to come, and he does come, and his name is Jesus, and he's born, and he lives, and then the Hebrews kill him. The one that's going to rescue, the Roman soldiers kill him. He's crucified. He's dead. And God raises him back up to life because I am can do that. John chapter 1 is another text that relates totally to Genesis chapter 1. In John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, it says this: In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. You see, the beginning meant Jesus was there in the beginning. And then if you flip to John chapter 5, verse 26, you see what God does through Jesus. In John chapter 5, verse 26, it says this: For as the Father has life in Himself, so He has granted the Son also to have life in Himself. A self-existent God who contains life within Him sends a Son who has life within Him, and then He's crucified. But then He comes back to life. And the resurrection for you and me tells us everything that we need to know about who God is and what He's able to do, because life is in Him and life is in His Son. And because the life is in Him, He can rescue. I don't know what you're going through today. I don't know what it is that's got you feeling like you need to cry out to God. But I want you to know this: God is the I Am, who always has been the I Am. I want you to know that He's watching over you, even though it feels like sometimes He may have forgotten you. I want you to know that God has a promise for you. That promise is that He will deliver you. And I want you to know that He will bring you up out of whatever it is that you're in. And you know what that means? That means what it meant for the Israelites. For God to deliver them, He couldn't just let them stay in Egypt. Now, you see, the Israelites might have been just totally fine with that. Hey, we just want to stay here. We've been here for 400 plus years. We kind of like to just settle down and get comfortable here. But God says, no, I'm going to bring you up out. I'm going to take you to something better. And that sometimes might be the hardest thing that God does for you when He rescues you, because He wants to bring you up and out. And you know what that might mean? That might mean for you that you actually have to literally move. It might mean that you have to literally say goodbye to some of the relationships that you're in. It might mean that you have to actually end some of the relationships you're in, because God sees you. He sees that you're oppressed, and He wants to bring you up out. And then you would like to say to God, no, God, I'm really good right here. I'd like to put myself back on the throne because I am able to do this. I am able to keep the same friends I had and be also able to defeat the addictions that I have, because I am capable. And God says to you, no, I am who I am. And I will bring you up and out of where you are so that you can be rescued. so that you can be in the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey that I want to give to you. You might say, God, no, I'm good. Like, I want you to save me from my sin. I want you to forgive me. But I also would just kind of like to keep the relationship I have. I know that my relationship isn't holy with this person that I'm dating. And I know it's not healthy. And I know I'm not walking in your ways. So I am able to keep that relationship and also be rescued by you. And God says, no, I am who I am. See, because I'm self-existent, because I always have been, I know better than you. And if I say that you need to be rescued, I'm going to need to pull you up and out of where you're at. And you're going to have to end the relationship. Well, God, from time to time, I know you really want to rescue me from the way I think, and I know you really want to rescue me from the bad habits that I have, but from time to time, it really would be okay to keep dabbling in. It's not that big of a deal, because I am able to control it. And God says, no, I am who I am. And I want to bring you up and out of where you are. And I want to bring you into a promised land. That means you might have to get some software on your computer to protect you. And you might have to stop putting yourself in situations where you know you're going to fail. And you might have to stop reading things that you read. And you might have to stop watching things that you watch. Because I want you to know that I can save you. But I am who I am, and you're not who you're not. And because I am who I am, I know what you really need. When you think about the self-existence of God, it truly does change everything. And here's the thing. As the band comes and as we wrap up and sing, every single problem that you are going through, this is what this means. Please stay with me as we close. Every single thing. You think of a problem that you have right now. You think of a struggle that you're going through. You think of anything that you're really wrestling with. And I promise you this. Behind every problem that you have, you will find a theological solution. Behind everything that you're going through, you will find something about God that will be an answer to whatever it is you're struggling with. Why? Because He always is. He always has been, and He always will be. And we haven't always been. We won't always be. Because He made us. He knows the design of us. And in Him we find a solution to every problem that we have. Because we have a God who is a self-caused cause. That means that He can make something come from nothing. And if it seems right now like you're stuck and nothing can really happen to change you, well, then you just need God, because He has this resurrection power that lives inside of you, that can really change you. If you think that the grave is dark, well, God, that's no big deal for Him, because He can do something with nothing. If you think that your life is hopeless, and there's no way you can be rescued out of the trap that you find yourself in, you've got a God who says, I can do something, when it seems like nobody else can do anything. Let's stand as we sing. hope you have a great week. If there's anything that we can do for you as you continue your walk with God, please let us know and be in touch with us. We'd love to encourage you in that. Have a great day.